Have you ever thought that a single phone call with no passwords and no account access could be enough to wipe out the entire retirement fund of a 71-year-old man? Money he spent his whole life saving, not because he was greedy, not because he believed in a high return investment, but simply because he heard his son's voice, panicked and broken, calling him in the exact familiar way he had heard for decades. The call began abruptly, as if the caller was shaking with fear. "Dad, I've been in an accident." Then a sob, then a pause, just long enough for a father's mind to fill in the worst possible image. Immediately after that, a second person came on the line, calmer, more controlled, using professional language. Introducing himself as a lawyer or a medical staff member, he did not explain much. He offered only a false choice. Transfer the money now, or the situation will get worse. What made it terrifying was that every word sounded reasonable. Every detail felt just believable enough to convince you this was not a scam, but a real family emergency unfolding in real time. And then the most frightening question appears. If your hands are shaking because you believe your child is in danger, would you still be calm enough to question the voice on the other end of the line? This is exactly what official warnings throughout 2024 and 2025 have emphasized. Criminals can now use voice cloning technology to impersonate family members, striking directly at the instinct to protect loved ones, especially among older adults who are used to trusting voices more than screens. My name is Dolan. On Financial Secrets, I do not tell stories to scare you. I tell them to help you see a chilling truth. The most dangerous scams do not target greed. They target fear and the trust you place in the people you love. In this episode, you will step into the exact 30 minutes that destroyed a lifetime of savings. And you will understand how a single voice can become a weapon. His name is Harold, 71 years old. He spent his entire life working a job that rarely makes headlines, but quietly keeps families running smoothly. He was a maintenance technician for a local utility company, reliable, on time, soft-spoken, always fixing things the moment they showed signs of trouble. When he retired, he did not carry a dramatic success story or a sudden leap into wealth to share with friends. What he had was a long list of correct decisions, repeated steadily over decades. He married early, raised his child with the rule of never borrowing for things that cause sleepless nights, and always viewed his retirement fund as the final door to peace. Harold lived alone in a suburban house that he had paid off years ago. The house was not new, but it was clean and orderly, just like the way he organized his life. He woke up early, made coffee, checked the mailbox, and walked a loop around the neighborhood. He did not spend much and did not chase technology. His phone did what he needed. He knew how to video call and send messages, but he was not someone who updated apps every week. He wrote down large expenses, carefully stored bank documents, and once a month logged into his accounts, not out of anxiety, but because he believed caution was the only way to live peacefully. In recent years, what Harold thought about most was not becoming richer, but not becoming a burden. Aging carries a quiet fear that does not announce itself loudly. It ticks steadily, like a clock. The fear that health might suddenly decline, that medical costs might rise, or simply that life might last longer than planned. Harold was not pessimistic, but he was realistic. He knew he would need money for things he could not predict, and that was why he guarded his retirement fund with a seriousness that was almost moral in nature. It was not just money. It was proof that he had fulfilled his responsibility as a father, as a husband, and later as an independent old man. Harold had an adult son who lived far away for work. They did not talk every day, but they shared a kind of bond that many families consider ordinary yet deeply solid. From time to time, his son would call to check in, send photos, share small stories. Harold was not expressive with words, but he listened carefully. He remembered the way his son stretched certain sounds when tired, the faster rhythm when stressed, the sighs he tried to hide when pretending to be strong. These things were not stored in bank records. They lived in family memory, and that was where the most dangerous vulnerability quietly existed, even though no one ever called it a vulnerability. Before the incident, Harold's life was so calm that from the outside you would think he belonged to the safest group imaginable. He did not join risky investment groups, did not transfer money to strangers online, and did not believe in promises of fast profits. He had heard a few scam stories, fake emails, impersonation calls, and he always believed he would recognize them immediately. What he did not know was that the world had changed in a way human senses are least prepared to defend against. Official warnings had emphasized that criminals no longer only impersonate names and documents, they can now replicate voices. Just a short audio clip taken from a public source can become the raw material for a phone call convincing enough to fool family members. Harold did not read those reports. He did not think he needed to. He had lived his whole life by a simple belief: if I do the right things, I will be fine. That day was no different from any other. He took his usual walk, stopped by a store to buy a few small items, and returned home as evening settled in. He ate dinner alone, kept the television volume low, and cleaned up afterward. The quiet time after dinner was when he felt that his life, though simple, was still in order. It was in that moment of order that the phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. Harold hesitated briefly, but he answered. Sometimes hospitals call. Sometimes neighbours. Sometimes service companies. He had not even finished his greeting when a voice burst out, urgent and panicked, using a single word that only family ever used. And at that moment, Harold was no longer a man who had kept financial discipline his entire life. He became a father. That was when the story shifted onto a different path. Not the path of money, but the path of fear. And once fear takes the wheel, the principles Harold trusted for decades would be tested in the most ruthless way. The voice on the other end of the line gave Harold no time to reorient himself to reality. It did not tell a full story. It released fragments, just enough to activate instincts a father never learns how to turn off. An accident, the police, someone injured, legal trouble. Each word landed like a hammer, striking the same weak point again and again. Harold tried to ask for more details, but the voice began to shake, broke mid-sentence, then fell silent at precisely the wrong moment. That silence was not a technical issue. It was part of the script. As Harold's voice began to speed up, another voice joined the call. Calmer, older, more authoritative. He introduced himself as a lawyer or a medical professional present at the scene. From that moment on, he controlled the conversation. He used language familiar to older adults, simple, direct, free of financial terminology. Everything centered on one idea. Time was running out. If this was not handled immediately, the situation would spiral beyond control. Harold asked if he could speak to his son. The answer was no. He was being treated and could not talk. Harold asked if he could call back in a few minutes. The answer was no again. Every question was blocked with a reason that sounded reasonable. And each time Harold hesitated, the pressure increased slightly. The police were waiting for a decision. The hospital needed confirmation. A file had been opened. This was no longer a phone call. It was a crisis engineered with precise timing. The most dangerous part was that Harold did not realize he was being manipulated. In his mind, everything still followed familiar moral logic. When family is in trouble, you act first. You do not negotiate. You do not analyze. You do what needs to be done to protect the people you love. At that moment, money completely lost its original meaning. It was no longer a retirement fund. It became a tool to end a nightmare unfolding in real time. The man on the line named an amount, not perfectly round, not so large that it triggered immediate suspicion, but enough to force Harold to open an account he rarely touched. He was guided step by step, slowly and clearly. No one shouted, no one threatened. The pressure came from calmness. And that calmness convinced Harold this was a legitimate process. a real procedure that, if followed correctly, would keep his son safe. Throughout the call, there was one rule that could never be broken. Harold was not allowed to hang up. Each time he suggested pausing, the man reminded him that they were keeping the line open for updates. Hanging up now could disrupt the process, Harold agreed. He did not realize that this uninterrupted connection was the final barrier preventing him from reaching reality. 30 minutes passed in a half-conscious haze. Harold followed instructions like someone trying to stay upright in thick fog. When the final transaction was confirmed, the voice said something that sounded reassuringly familiar. "Everything has been handled. We will contact you again." Then the line went dead. The house fell silent. The television was still on. The wall clock kept ticking. But something had slipped from Harold's grasp without him fully realizing it. He sat still for a few minutes, then stood up, as if he had just completed something difficult. Only when he looked at his account did the truth begin to reveal itself, slowly and cruelly. Harold sat staring at the screen longer than usual. At first, he assumed the banking system was simply updating slowly. He refreshed the page, then refreshed it again. The numbers did not return to their original place. They remained frozen in an emptiness he had never seen before. The entire sum he had always called the foundation of his retirement safety was gone. Not reduced, not frozen, gone. The first sensation was not panic. It felt like missing a step in the dark, a brief moment of disorientation that froze the body before the mind could react. Harold stood up, walked a few steps across the living room, then returned to the chair. He reopened the transaction history and read each line slowly, as if staring long enough might force reality to correct itself. The transactions were valid, properly authorized, confirmed by his own actions. Only then did Harold think to call his real son. The call was short. There had been no accident, no police, no hospital. On the other end was a normal, healthy voice, completely unaware of what had just happened. The moment was not loud. There was no screaming, no dramatic collapse, only a long, painful silence as two realities that could not coexist collided. Harold ended the call. He sat down, hands resting on his knees, staring straight ahead. Everything in the house was still there. The furniture, the family photos, the objects he had carefully preserved for years. But the sense of safety, the invisible structure he believed he had already finished building, collapsed without leaving a physical trace. He understood there had been no technical error, no misunderstanding. He had followed every step correctly. And that was what made the truth hardest to accept. In later investigative reports, moments like this are usually described in a single line. The victim realizes the transaction is complete, recovery is unlikely, but no report captures what it feels like to realize you were guided by the deepest part of your own affection. No one prepares you for the moment when a voice you trusted turns out not to be real. Harold did not sleep that night. He did not cry. He did not call anyone else. One question repeated itself in his mind, without an answer. If I did everything right my entire life, how could one phone call destroy it all? That question would stay with him long after the money had moved beyond any account that could still be traced. And at that point, the story stopped being just about a scam. It became a story about what happens when technology crosses the final boundary of human trust. The next morning, Harold did what most victims do when everything is already too late. He called the bank. The conversation was polite, slow, and filled with familiar responses. The transactions had been properly authorized. There were no signs of unauthorized access. No systems had been breached. According to the records, Harold himself had approved every transfer. The bank documented the case and advised him to contact authorities, but no one promised a solution. After that came the call to the FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center. Harold had to tell his story from the beginning, detail by detail, repeating fragments of conversations he could still remember. On the other end of the line, the response was calm, almost routine. He was told that many similar cases had been reported over the past year. The same script, the same pacing, the same ending. The chances of recovering the money were very low, because these transfers are typically routed through multiple layers and disappear before any freeze can be issued. The days that followed moved more slowly than before. Harold had to face new numbers, far smaller than what he once believed would be enough for the rest of his life. He was not forced out of his home. He still had a basic pension, but the sense of safety he had relied on for years was gone. Every spending decision, no matter how small, now triggered long calculations in his head, not because he was immediately short on money, but because the future had suddenly become unclear. Harold did not talk much about what happened. He felt ashamed, not because he believed he was foolish, but because he felt he had failed in his role as the protector of his own life. He wondered whether friends would think he had been careless, whether his family would see him differently. This is a part of the aftermath that reports rarely mention. After the money disappears, confidence disappears with it. Gradually, Harold began reading the warnings he had once ignored. He saw his own experience reflected in the dry language of official reports. AI can replicate voices. Calls are designed to deny victims time to think. Psychological pressure is applied deliberately. He realized he was not an exception. He was part of a new wave where technology does not need to break financial systems to steal money. It only needs to break human trust. This realization did not bring his money back, but it gave him clarity. What happened was not because he was weak. It happened because the scam was designed to defeat people who are responsible, caring, and disciplined. The very qualities that had kept his life stable were the ones that had been exploited. Harold's story does not end with everything returning to normal. It ends with a quiet adjustment, a more cautious life, a less certain future, and a new understanding that in today's world, trust can no longer be given based solely on what your ears hear. If you see Harold's story as just a personal scam, you miss the most important point. What makes this case dangerous is not the amount of money lost, but the way it shatters a deeply rooted human assumption. For thousands of years, a voice has been proof of presence. If you hear someone speak, your brain assumes they are real, present, and trustworthy. Technology has changed that. Human instinct has not caught up. Official warnings in recent years point to the same conclusion. Voice-based scams do not target financial ignorance, they target emotional reflexes. When fear appears, the human brain prioritizes action over analysis. This is especially true in situations involving family members, children, or legal consequences. Cross-checking becomes nearly impossible. This is not a personal failure, it is a biological limitation. The most important lesson is not to distrust every phone call. That is neither realistic nor healthy. The lesson is to change the standard of verification. In a world where voices can be cloned, hearing a familiar voice is no longer enough. Families need simple, clear rules. Never transfer money based solely on a phone call. Always hang up and call back using a saved number. Always confirm through a second channel before acting. These steps may seem excessive, but they create the pause that every scam depends on eliminating. Another lesson rarely discussed is isolation. Harold lost his money in silence and then carried the consequences in silence. That silence allows scams to continue because each victim believes they are alone. The truth is, thousands of people are experiencing the same thing. Speaking up may not recover the money, but it prevents others from making the same mistake. Ultimately, this story reminds us that financial security is no longer just about passwords and systems. It is about personal boundaries and emotional reflexes. You can have a solid retirement plan, a reasonable investment portfolio, and decades of disciplined behavior. But if you are not prepared for a moment of emotional crisis, all of it can collapse during a single phone call. This is not a warning meant to make you live in fear. It is a reminder that the world has changed and the way we protect ourselves must change with it. If you listened to this story and thought it only happens to other people, that belief itself is the most dangerous gap. Harold did not lose his money because he lacked knowledge. He lost it because he reacted like a normal father in an abnormal moment. And that can happen to anyone who has not prepared a stopping point. After finishing this episode, do one simple thing. Talk to your family. Not about technology, not about AI, but about rules. Agree clearly that no one transfers money based on a phone call alone. Agree that any emergency must be verified through at least one other channel. These conversations may feel uncomfortable, but they cost far less than the price of silence. If you have elderly parents, do not just send them an article or a generic warning. Tell them a story, like the one you just heard, because the most dangerous scams are not defeated by information. They are defeated by psychological preparation before fear takes control. Financial Secrets exists not to frighten you, but to help you recognize the signals most people only notice when it is too late. If this story caused you to pause and think even once before acting in the future, it has done its job. If you found this episode valuable, share it with someone you care about, not to spread anxiety, but to create an invisible layer of protection through awareness. And if you want to continue exploring the quiet financial stories with the greatest destructive power in the modern world, follow Financial Secrets. Some financial secrets are not hidden in numbers. They live in the moment you decide what to trust.